All right, good afternoon. Welcome to the Fairbank Center for Chinese Studies at Harvard University. My name is Michael Soni. I am the director of the Fairbank Center, and it is my privilege to introduce today's session, marking 30 years since the extraordinary events of May and June of 1989. While we have called today's session Tiananmen at 30, of course these events occurred not just at Tiananmen Square or even just in Beijing, but in cities all over China. These events culminated, as we all know, on June 4th, 1989, in an act of military suppression that took place also not only or even primarily in the square itself, but throughout the city and beyond. Anyone could have predicted that this year, 2019, would be a sensitive year for anniversaries in China. As Jian wrote in the New Yorker this week, for the CCP, certain anniversaries teeter between the emblematic and the problematic. As things have unfolded, the year proved far more sensitive for far more anniversaries than we had anticipated. Problematic definitely outweighed emblematic. Besides the 40th anniversary of the establishment of U.S.-China relations, the 40th anniversary of the Taiwan Relations Act, here at the Fairbank Center we've held events including a commemoration of 40 years of reform and opening up, which we co-hosted, co-organized with the Unirule Institute of Economics. And that event, we believe, proved to be one of the very last, if not the very last, public event for that very influential liberal think tank in China. We similarly commemorated the centenary of the May 4th movement with a two-day conference organized by Professor David Wang. Some of you, like me, were at that conference, and I think many of us who attended that conference were discouraged that, as one of our guests, Jeff Wasserstrom, pointed out in his long New York Times op-ed, a century after May 4th, a free and open discussion of that event and its significance remains impossible in China. As with May 4th, so too June 4th. But even in a year of sensitive anniversaries, there's something distinctive about the event we commemorate today, because of course there are no commemorations at all of this event in China, or no public commemorations of this event at all in China. This is an event that can only be spoken of outside of China. The Fairbank Center at Harvard is home for China studies in all forms, even and in some ways especially when the topic is sensitive. We value our commitment to the intellectual freedom to pursue questions and research that others might want us to avoid. It's our responsibility to hold events such as today's, both as an academic endeavor in the face of official suppression in China and as a mark of respect to those whose lives were taken or scarred by the events 30 years ago. The importance of our discussions on the CCP's relationship with the Chinese citizenry is only elevated by the context of other human rights crises that are unfolding in China today. In particular, the current crisis in Xinjiang reinforces the importance of our persistent pursuit of truth in the face of repression. Let me just say a couple of words about the ground rules for today's event. I will introduce our moderator in a moment and then ask her to introduce the panelists. Today's event is being recorded by the Fairbank Center for future broadcast. Please, for obvious reasons, we ask that there be no additional recording, no private recording on cell phones and so on, and we will come and ask you to stop if we observe that happening. In a break from the usual Fairbank Center practice, we will not ask those who ask questions to identify themselves. So you are perfectly free to ask your questions anonymously. And I should also add that the ultimate, whatever form the ultimate broadcast takes, only the speakers will be recorded for broader distribution. So you need have no fears on that score. Let me now begin today's event by introducing our moderator, Professor Rowena He, currently a member of the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton University, the author of the book, Tiananmen Exiles, Voices of the Struggle for Democracy in China, a book which she completed while she was a postdoc here at the Fairbank Center. While also at the Fairbank Center, she created the freshman seminar, Tiananmen in History and Memory, which was an extraordinary successful and important course that she taught for 5 years, from 2010 to 2015. She is an old friend of the Fairbank Center. It's our honor to support Rowena's work. So please join me in welcoming Rowena.
Thank you so much, Michael, and thank you I would like to thank the Fairbank Center for organizing the event. What Michael said just now, I'm sure for many of us who had, I'm sure many of us are here, like Professor Cui Weiping in the audience, who had been Tiananmen the whole time in 1989, and Adi, who had been reporting for the Wall Street Journal in 1989. I'm sure it means a lot for us to be here today. And it's also, as Michael mentioned, we always have special rules when we organize events for the anniversary. All those years when I organize my student events, I make that rule, and probably that's the reality we have to face. We care, we refuse to forget, but then we face all this fear, even outside China, and that's a battle of war against memory that we have been trying to fight against collectively inside and outside China all these years. So I think that's exactly why it's so important for us to be here today. Before I introduce the speakers, I also would like to talk about someone who has been very important supporting this work all those years. He's my dear mentor, Professor Rob Mafagwa, and every time he will be sitting at the front, supporting and encouraging. He's been a role model for so many of us, as Wang Dan told Diana just now. And now Rod is gone, but for those of us who are determined to follow his steps and his inspirations, and we are going to pick up the job. It's hard, it's difficult, it's challenging, it's daunting, but he always showed us that we should stand up to the principles and support not just the Chinese just to understand the Chinese politics, to reconstruct history, but also care about the Chinese people, their lives, and China's future. And when Rod, when I told him about this panel, he wrote me, "Excellent news. No longer will you have to do all the work to remember Tiananmen." And I'm saving this message to remind myself. And I know that Rod is not sitting in the first front today, but his spirit is with us in this room, always, as always. So I would like to introduce our first speaker, Professor Jian, from the from the Beijing Field Academy, and I'm sure it's particularly meaningful for Professor Jian to be here today, because 5 years ago, when he organized a private commemoration in his home in Beijing, right afterward, 5 of them were detained and arrested, and many of you, like Pu Zhiqiang, had lost his freedom after that event. So it's particularly meaningful for us to welcome him today to speak for us freely and openly on this campus for the first time since 1989. Let's welcome Professor Jian.
I'm so glad the Professor Mercosani updates the Chinese situation for you. The first sentence of my speech is, after 30 years, this is the first time to commemorate the June 4th incident in public for me. I give my sincere appreciation to Fairbank Center for Chinese Studies, Thank you for holding this open discussion. Thank you to all of you, the audience today. I'm happy to have the opportunity to communicate with you and exchange some ideas. The Tiananmen Massacre on June 4th, 1989 was not only a vital milestone in Chinese history, but also a historical turning point for the end of the Cold War, the failure of communism. It was a tragic example to people from Eastern Europe, communist countries. It also made people from all over the world know more about the violence nature of a communist totalitarian regime. After 1989, we Chinese people bore immense pressure in every aspect of our social life. Many countries are moving towards constitutional democracy and social justice, but China is not. In June 4th incident, the June 4th incident also changed my understanding of the Chinese regime and my personal life. I was at Tiananmen Square on June 3rd, hearing the roar of armored cars. I walked out of Beijing Film Academy's tent. Later that night, a student was shot down in 20 meters in front of me. When we escaped out of the Chang'an Avenue, we were still chanting slogans, and the whole street was permeated with smoke, from smoke bombs. In the morning of June 4th, I got a call telling me that my male cousin had not returned home. I immediately went to Fuxing Hospital and saw his name on the list, on the casualty list on the wall. There were dozens of corpses on the floor, but I failed to recognize him among those corpses. Maybe because people's face change after death, but more likely, I did not want to recognize him among those corpses. In the following days, I went to dozens of other hospitals, opened the refrigerators to check corpses. After half a month, I returned to Fuxing Hospital and found his corpse. At that time, his body has turned jet black. After the June 4th crackdown, China has suffered from terror. When I ordered this gravestone, I did not dare to put inscriptions on it. Only after 6 years did I hire stonemason to write the name on it. Tiananmen mothers also went through this process of walking away from fear because they each had family members killed in the June 4th. They become targeted groups and were often followed and harassed by the police. On the urn stand, Zhang Xinling discovered a note. Zhang Xinling is the right. She found a note saying, "I have the same destiny as you." This note was left by Yu Weijie. They have worked together ever since. Now, Yu Weijie is a spokesperson of the Tiananmen mothers. I have been trying my best to help Tiananmen mothers to do something, such as attempting to contact and visit bereaved families. Intellectuals of 1989 generation, such as Liu Xiaobo, wrote a lot of joint petitions and lots of articles. In 1995, Liu Xiaobo and the Tiananmen mothers presented those petitions. I convinced my uncle and aunt to overcome their fear. They signed the joint petition of the Tiananmen mothers. After the publication of Chapter 08, Liu Xiaobo was arrested by the Chinese authorities. We, his friends, suffered a tough crackdown. When we went to visit Liu Xiaobo's wife, we don't know what to say to her. In April 2009, we hesitated. Shall we continue to speak out in this high-handed political environment? Eventually, we become firm in our decision to commemorate the June 4th incident and speak for it. We thought this is the best support for Liu Xiaobo in prison. So, in April 2009, we secretly convened a June 4th seminar. We couldn't find a formal meeting place, so we used the meeting room in a restaurant. After the meeting, we published the information and the photos on the internet. Because of the government's control, I made the seminar banner in different stores. You see, I cut this banner on spot, yeah, and pieced them together into one, yeah. During the June 4th, during the early of the June that year, I was followed by a policeman and my student. They find, oh, you are the student of Jian. Okay, you don't follow Jian. He was signed to follow to another professor in Beijing Film Academy, Cui Weiping. This commemoration in 2009, here is so crowded. It's hard for you to find me because we got no place. We do this in Zhang Xianling's apartment. In 2014, a commemoration of the 25th anniversary of June 4th was held at my home. Okay, I limited this because He Xiaoqing has introduced it for you. Oh, this is the topic that seminar in 2014. And you see, after that seminar, Xiaoqing offered to take the responsibility. He emphasized to the police that he was the only organizer of the seminar. And also, this is Pu Zhiqiang, a very famous human rights lawyer, and also an intellectual who kept speaking out in public. He is one of the 1989 generation, as Wang Dan. His life was dramatically changed by the June 4th incident. It was I who asked Pu Zhiqiang attend the June 4th seminar. I felt guilty about that. So I was very surprised that he sent his thanks to me for inviting him. He said that he had been investigated by the police and that it was just a matter of time before he would be sent to prison. He was willing to attend the June 4th seminar at the cost of imprisonment. He believed that he had the responsibility to speak for June 4th. He was proud of to do so. Pu Zhiqiang got probationary of 3 years, during which time he had to wear a monitoring device. When I met with him, he was busy trying to find a power supply to recharge his GPS. Oh, I found this picture from the internet. It's not the real one. And Elder Hu Shigen, who attended this meeting, is still in jail. Because of a time limited, I cannot introduce many other individuals and groups. For example, some people labeled as thugs by the Chinese government after June 4th incident, some of whom were sentenced to death, some of whom were sent to prison for years. This is the last year we commemorate our relatives. You see a lot of policemen around here. Sometimes there are more policemen than ours. I will end this speech by showing a bamboo painting by a June 4th thug, Wen Jian. He was sentenced to 7 years imprisonment because of organizing a protest in Beijing. Preserve the bloody memory, prevent the tragedy from repeating itself. I must do what I should do. We must do what we should do. Thank you. Thank you for suffering from my broken English.
Professor Hao Jian has published many books. He's eloquent and he knows his work. But when he found out that he would have a chance to speak today, I can't remember how many times we communicate and how much time he had worked for this 10 minutes talk. Not because he tried to look good, not because he proved his English is good, or not because he wanted to show that he knows better, but because he wanted to make sure that he used this 10 minutes for the first time in 30 years in his life, that he can speak openly to our audience and to tell them what happened. And as Michael eloquently spoke at the beginning, so that those voices that have been silenced, those memories that has been erased, and those young lives who cannot speak for themselves would be heard, and the memory would be remembered. And this would be a good time to introduce Louisa Lim, who had written this important book, The People's Republic of Amnesia, Tiananmen Revisited. As we all know how difficult it is to work on sensitive topics like Tiananmen, so it's really courageous of her to pick up this topic and to write this book. And she, in her important book, she also mentioned the crackdown in Sichuan, in Chengdu, which had not been covered. So this is very important for us to know that not just in Tiananmen, in Beijing, that the killing happened, but also in other places. So let's welcome Louisa.
Thank you, Rowena, and thank you, Michael, and everyone at the Fairbank Center for organizing this. And particularly thank you, Jian, for describing what the act of memory is like inside China today. I'm going to talk about Beijing's amnesia on June the 4th, how it's being enforced and exported. And I'm going to start with words written by Liu Xiaobo, China's Nobel Peace Laureate, who died in police custody from cancer. As you probably know, he was one of those who helped broker the truce that allowed students to leave the square in 1989. And after that, every year he wrote an elegy to Tiananmen. And these are words from his 2002 elegy, but I think they sum up Beijing's success in erasing Tiananmen from the collective memory, and they were so well illustrated by Hodgins' slides. He said, all roadways are blocked, all tears are under surveillance, all fresh flowers are shadowed, all memories are purged, all tombstones are still blank. 17 years later, 17 years after he wrote those words, they're still true, and even more so than before, I think. The author Yan Yanke described amnesia in China as a state-sponsored sport. And one of the most popular events in that sport is forgetting Tiananmen. I wrote in my book about how China's managed to erase the collective memory of June the 4th so successfully that when I went around campuses asking students if they could identify the picture of Tank Man, only 15 out of 100 students were able at that time to identify the picture. And it really shows how memory has become so politicized. But I think since then, the control over history and memory has only tightened. We've seen history being legislated with new laws to protect heroes and martyrs. And increasingly, private remembrances are being penalized, as Jian illustrated. But I think what's really interesting is now we're also seeing attempts to export that amnesia, and we're increasingly seeing Western corporations lured by the Chinese market that are doing Beijing's bidding and censoring content about Tiananmen, both inside and outside China. So just a couple of examples that have happened in recent years. Just in the last month, we saw Apple removing Tiananmen-related songs by canto pop stars, including Jackie Jian, from inside China, from the catalog there. Over the past few years, there have been a couple of incidents where LinkedIn has censored users outside China from posting content on June the 4th. And they even, the spokesman even explained this by saying it was a move to create value for our members. And then we saw the China Quarterly, a scholarly magazine, scholarly journal, being given a list of titles to take down. And out of the more than 300 titles that the authorities asked the China Quarterly to remove from its website inside China, it's interesting that 10% of those had Tiananmen or June the 4th in their title. And another case which is particularly interesting. It was reported by the Wall Street Journal about a Chinese education company called VIP Kids. And they fired 2 American teachers for talking about Tiananmen and Taiwan in their online classes. The interesting thing about this is that the teachers were not in China. They were in America. They were teaching online to students in China. So think about that. This is a company that employs 60,000 teachers in the US and Canada, but mainly teaching Chinese kids. So in this way, we're seeing those closed discursive spaces of Chinese classrooms being exported overseas. And we're also seeing this sort of sustained and coordinated campaign to influence Western reporting on the Tiananmen anniversary. So I recently done a survey of journalists' anniversary reporting, and 3/4 of the respondents in my survey reported experiencing harassment of various types from the authorities. The most obvious type was being blocked from going to Tiananmen Square. That happened to 60% of respondents. And almost the same number had access to sources blocked. 1/5 of journalists had their sources harassed or detained. And the same number also had complaints about their coverage. And even in the harassment, there's all kinds of innovation. Recently, there have been pictures that you've probably seen of Tiananmen Square increasingly being blanketed by security cameras. And often these are sort of AI-powered facial recognition cameras. But there are also very low-tech methods that are being used. And in 2009, there was a particular year when the innovation was super low-tech. So the security forces, plainclothes policemen, took to the square with umbrellas. And they would literally stand between cameramen and the journalists to ruin their pieces to camera so they couldn't report from the square. So all of this is a coordinated campaign from different arms of the government, which really, it limits the reporting and it limits the type of story that gets told, because access to those people who remember what happened, to those memory carriers, is limited. And so we are seeing, in this way, the process of forgetting the actual movement itself being accelerated and exported, because journalists can only write one story, the story of repression. They can't write any other stories. So Philip Graham very famously said, journalists write the first draft of history. But here, through these kind of attempts, I think we're seeing a repressive state which is slowly and very patiently redacting and retroactively editing that draft of history so that we forget in the West, we forget the movement, we only remember that act of repression. So my book came out 5 years ago, and in the time since then, I've talked in classrooms around the world, in the US, the UK, Australia, Germany, Hong Kong, about Tiananmen. It's been really interesting because I've seen in the questions that mainland students have asked almost a shift. So at the beginning, students were often quite defensive, and they would ask questions like, you know, all countries do things like this. What makes China any different? Or sometimes they would ask, you know, China's economic growth today, its success today is based on what the government did back then. You know, surely it was worth it. But recently I've seen another line of questioning, which I think is very interesting. And I'm going to read you a quote from a student who asked a question in Sydney, who said, "Why do we have to look back to this time in history? Why do you think it will be helpful to current and nowadays China, especially our young generation? Do you think it could be harmful to what the Chinese government calls the harmonious society?" Well, isn't that interesting? The Chinese government has succeeded in making knowledge dangerous. It's succeeded in seeding that idea that knowledge can have a price, and that price can be too high. I think Liu Xiaobo's words are more true than ever today, as we see these new methods of social control, like the social credit system. And we see the price of memory becoming more and more concrete. And we see silence spreading through channels, including Western ones. Recently, some of the most poignant acts of memory that we've seen emerging from China have actually been completely wordless. I don't know how many of you have seen it, but there's this astonishing 11-second video that emerged this year of a young man reenacting the Tank Man photograph in the Beijing Military Museum. So he's standing in front of a real Chinese army tank, and he's holding two bags, one plastic bag in either hand, no words at all. On the 26th anniversary, an activist called Jian Lin went to Tiananmen Square, and he opened a black umbrella on the square, and he was immediately detained for picking quarrels and stirring up trouble. I think this just shows that in a time when words have become dangerous, even the lack of words no longer offers any protection. And just as a final thought, I just wanted to underline one thing. I'm not an activist, I'm a journalist. But I think the success of Beijing's state-imposed amnesia means that any public discussion of Tiananmen has become a challenge to Beijing's narrative. And because of this, there's not really any way to talk about Tiananmen and not challenge amnesia. So anyone who talks about Tiananmen, who remembers it publicly, who writes about it a lot, by default, you become seen as an activist. And I'd also like to point out that I think this reflects Beijing's success in setting the parameters of discussion, even well beyond its borders. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Louisa. I think, as Louisa mentioned, there's all these efforts to make sure that we forget and we would no longer remember. But the fact that so many of you are here today, your presence already showed that we collectively refuse to forget and we still remember. I saw so many faces. Probably I only would see each time when there's a Tiananmen event, and for over a decade. And people often ask me, how can you still continue after all this? And I think it's these faces that I always remember when struggling in darkness, because I know that I'm not alone. So many people actually are doing the same thing in their own way to remember and to refuse to forget. And the beauty of today, I think, is today we are able to see so many of the people maybe in the past. You saw that they were struggling there. They were in prison. They were being harassed. They were being tortured. And then now they are in, and at that time we were not able to tell them how much we care. But today we are in the same room, in the same space, shared space, and our identity are defined as someone that who refused to forget. And for this note, I want to introduce our next speaker, Mr. Wang Dan, or Dr. Wang Dan, who got his PhD from Harvard here. Of course, you all know that in 1989, he topped the 21 most wanted list, and he was in prison and later exiled. I remember the first time I managed to go to Beijing and visit his mom, and she kept me for dinner, and she told me that she always remembered the image when he was carrying his school bag and biking to school, and she always wished that image would appear in the window again. And that was more than a decade ago that she said that to me. And now Wang Dan still cannot return to China, but he's here with us today, and he's now the founder and the director for the, what's that called? Dialogue China. He's hoping that we can continue to engage dialogues with China. Let's welcome Dr. Wang Dan.
I need your pardon me to allow me to sit. I'm not feeling very well, and sitting here make me more casual. Cause for me, like go back to home, it's really great to back to Fairbank Center, where I grew up here, not physically but spiritually. And I thank Michael and Dan and Rowena to make this possible. It's very important to have this event to remember what happened in 1989. I can still remember 10th anniversary of 1989 also happened at Harvard. We have a much bigger event at the President Hall. And both the speaker, Nancy Pelosi, and the widow of Martin Luther King Jr. attend. After 20 years, so many things changed and make me speechless. But I have to speak something here. Due to the time limit, I will focus on only one question. This is a hypothetical question, which is, if the 1989 democracy movement had succeeded, what could China look like today? Answer this question, I think first require us to define what is a success for the 1989 democracy, because I think one of the biggest misunderstanding people have of the 1989 democracy movement is expressed by the question like this: if you, they pointed to me, if you take the power as the president of China, would you have been better than Chinese Communist Party or Xi Jinping? I think it's really wrong question. I can't imagine I can be the leader of China. I even cannot control my classmate. So this high-toned challenge is in fact completely bogus. Because in 1989, the student never mentioned replacing the Communist Party or proposed taking power ourselves. And regardless of how the 1989 democracy movement would have developed, there was no possibility of student leaders becoming national leaders. Success in 1989 for us means achieving our objectives. And what were that? The political position of the 1989 democracy movement were first proposed in the, we call the 7 points petition that student representatives, including me, myself, submitted to the leaders of CCP. Those 7 points requirement, including re-evaluation of the years and the achievement of former General Secretary Hu Yaobang, and completely negating the campaign, so-called eliminate spiritual pollution and the campaign against the bourgeoisie liberalism, and publishing the salary and all other forms of income of state leaders, etc., etc. That's our goal. If we can achieve those goals, that is success. So there's no category like being a national leader. However, I believe that success of 1989 democracy movement should be measured against 2 very important conditions raised during the May 13th students' hunger strike. Because hunger strike transformed the whole student movement into a popular mass movement, or we call democracy movement. And from then on, the full force of nationwide support focused on demanding that the government accept the demand of students in their hunger strike. This implies that if the 1989 democracy movement had succeeded, the government would have automatically accepted these 2 demands by the hunger strike students. Some people criticize our student movement are very radical. Let's say if this is radical, 3,000 students sacrificed their life in Tiananmen Square, only want 2 achievements. We only have 2 requirements. If the government take those 2 requirements, of course we will withdraw from the Tiananmen Square. And 2 demands is, 1, we demand that the government promptly engage in a concrete dialogue on an equal footing with the dialogue delegation of peoples of Beijing's university and other universities. This is a dialogue. That's why I call it our new think tank, Dialogue China. I still have this dream, dialogue. We just ask a dialogue. We use our life to ask a dialogue. Is this radical? And our second demand is, we demand that the government fairly evaluate this student movement and affirm it as a patriotic and a democratic student movement, not a turmoil. We hope the government can change their tone in the April 26 editorial. Don't see us as a criminal. We are patriotic. We hope our country can be better. Is this requirement really radical? So when somebody criticized the student at that time radical, is that fair? You can think about it. Of course, I have my answers. But discussing the question of what if 1989 democracy movement had succeeded, therefore demand discussing the effect on China's future if the government had begun a dialogue with the student and had affirmed the student movement as patriotic in nature. I feel it would have had the following three main effects if they accept our demand. First, if 1989 democracy movement had succeeded, the reformist factions within the party, represented by former General Secretary Zhao Ziyang, would certainly have been fortified. It's common knowledge that Zhao Ziyang was the senior CCP leader who most inclined toward market economic reforms, and also the most open-minded leaders. If Zhao Ziyang had greater policy-making authority, I believe he would surely have led China to undertake more profound marketization reforms in the economic sphere. And this trend could be seen in the bankruptcy law initiated in 1988. In other words, if 1989 student movement had succeeded, China would not have fallen in social instability like what happened today. Rather, would have stepped up the pace of economic reform with even greater result. Secondly, if 1989 democracy movement had succeeded, the political reform which launched in 1988 would have been eased forward with the stronger support of a popular view, especially the part of freedom of the press. That is to say, economic reform would have been promoted in a better environment of supervision by public opinions. Today, even Chinese Communist Party acknowledge that expanding the power of supervision by public opinion is the only way to effectively contain the spread of corruption throughout the country. So if the expansion of freedom of speech had begun back in 1989, corruption would not have spread throughout the whole China system as it has today. Thirdly, if 1989 democracy movement had succeeded, it would have created a model for the dialogue between state and society, which is so important, not for the past, even for the future of China. In fact, the political report of CCP's 13th National Congress, drafted under another open-minded high-level officials, Bao Tong's leadership, established consultation and dialogue with the public as the focal orientation of political reform. And when the students called for dialogue, they were effectively echoing this demand for political reform. In today's China, the prospect for the government and the people being of one heart and mind has vanished. And the people have lost all confidence in the government. They are collectively give up their responsibility for this country. And I think the government also give up the responsibility for the country too. This is the main reason why so many social conflicts automatically adopt a violent method. When reform becomes a game between government and society, a dialogue between state and society becomes a fundamental safeguard for social stability. So only then can the two sides make an effort to ensure a smooth and steady transformation. Taiwan's experience provided the best reference of this. So if 1989 democracy movement had succeeded, we can imagine that it would have provided a much, much better environment for reform for China. And I think this is the question I want to discuss. Due to the time limit, I just focus on this question, but before I stop, I have something to say here personally. I want to say that what happened in 1989 had a critical effect on my personal life, mainly manifested in the fact that having this history, there are some things not left entirely to my choice today, such as the idea of promoting social progress or living up to certain expectations. As an ordinary student, I could have chosen a personal life or a public life, but now I have no choice but to live under the public eye. It's hard to say whether this is my good or bad fortune, but I feel I can only face and accept this. Furthermore, if the same thing were to happen again, I believe I would still not turn back, because embracing social ideals when one is young is not a matter of a rational choice. It can almost be considered as an emotional necessary choice. I have to say that this emotion is really good and also time sensitive. When one is older, as older as me, it's very difficult to experience the passion of youth. Human life is really limited, and I would not give up the opportunity to join my life experience to the future of my country and my social ideals, even if only temporarily. That's why I have absolutely no regret for the price I have paid, which is 7 years in prison and cannot go back to my country probably forever. I think this is my own life choice, and I will continue to go forward without any hesitation. Thank you very much.
I remember in those years when I was working on my book with Wang Dan and many of the exiles, one thing in our group discussion, one day when we were having our shared discussion, and we were saying being idealistic in China means you are very selfish, because we chose what we have to do for our country, but our family, my mom, his mom, cannot choose not to be our family members. The price that you have to pay for your idealism. And Wang Dan made a very good point, important point earlier. In 1989, students were not looking for a revolution. We were not looking for regime change. Two best examples, Wang Dan mentioned the 70 monks, right, on the day of Hu Yaobang's funeral outside the People's Great Hall. The 3 students were kneeling, the 70 monks, kneeling down, begging the government to come out and listen to them. So that's one example. The second example, of course, the 3 men who throw paintings on Mao's portrait. And immediately afterward, they were taken to the police by the students. The students turned them in because they wanted to show that we are not trying to give you trouble. We are just your loyal kids, hoping that you will listen to us. And I interviewed one of these men 2 months ago in Indianapolis. He had been bitten so badly, he totally lost his mind. He's now mentally disabled, Yu Dongyue. The only thing that he only could say a few incomplete sentences, but there's one sentence, he said it again and again, and it was stuck in my mind. He said that he kept repeating the same sentence. This is not done by the people. This is not done by the students. And I didn't understand what he was talking about, so I went back to my archive materials. It turned out there's a big photo in Tiananmen Square, the day when the students turned them to the police. The students had a big banner in both Chinese and English. 不是学生干的，不是人民干的. This is not done by the student. This is not done by the people. Meaning that these are troublemakers, but we are not. We are just your loyal kids. We are on the side of the government. If the students had known that just 10 days later, 200,000 army soldiers and equipped with AK-47 and tanks would be coming, maybe they would have changed their mind to turn this man in. But that's just 2 examples to show that they were not looking for a revolution. Our next speaker, Professor Jeff Wasserstrom, he has been very supportive to helping the younger generation and helping us to understand and do this work on China. So, and he's of course a important professor in the field, a Chancellor professor of history at the University of California, Irvine, and also he had published this important book to understand China in the 21st century. That's the title of the book. So let's welcome Jeff. Thanks.
So this is also a homecoming for me. I got my master's here at Harvard and was invited back the first time to give a public talk was right after finishing a dissertation at Berkeley on the history of student movements, and to speak on 1989, an event with Wu Kai-shi, another of the student leaders then. I feel very humbled, and I find it difficult to think of how to speak after hearing these inspiring talks by people who've lived and documented and pushed back against memory so much. I'm going to try to take a different take on this through, of all things, some works of fiction. One of the events that has stayed with me a lot in thinking through 1989's meaning was in 2003, I was invited to speak at Heidelberg College, a liberal arts college that was having a bonding experience for the incoming freshmen. They were all watching the film The Gate of Heavenly Peace, which is an inspiring film about 1989 that I had the privilege to be a consultant on. And they asked me if I would come and speak to the freshmen in a kind of orientation about that. And I said yes immediately. They said, then they called me a week before the event and said, by the way, the students who are incoming class are also reading a novel together as a shared experience. That novel is Brave New World. I hope you can talk about that as well. And my first thought was, damn, why couldn't it have been 1984? As we've heard, 1984 is the book that introduced the idea of a memory hole, which is where the Chinese Communist Party has sought to put Tiananmen. It's newspeak, all kinds of things about the control of memory. Orwell's 1984 described the reign of oppression being the boot on the face over and over again. All of these things come to mind when we think about the suppression of 1989 and the official efforts to forget it, to make people forget it. But then I read Brave New World, which I hadn't read since a teenager. I didn't remember anything about it from reading as a teenager, except there was this drug called Soma that made you feel good all the time. And there were these very distracting, somewhat pornographic movies you watched called Feelies. But I reread it, and I thought about this, and I thought about what had happened in China since 1989, and how the Chinese Communist Party, in part, had stayed in power. And it had done it, Orwell's vision was the boot on the face. Huxley's vision was ruled by distraction and playing to people's pleasures and hedonisms. And in many ways, since 1989, the Chinese Communist Party has stayed in power in part by a combination of these kinds of things, blended. I'm not the only one who's thought about these together. As far back as the 1950s, Huxley was saying, actually, in some parts of the world, you see a mix and match of these two techniques, of Orwell, his former student at Eden, and his own vision for that. So that changed my way of thinking about 1989 and post-1989, and I think it's still there, the way in which, to some degree, people in China are kept in place. People resist in all kinds of interesting, daring ways, but when they don't, some of it is distraction and hedonism, materialism, consumerism, as well as fear. Then in 2014, I got wrapped up in and excited by the umbrella movement in Hong Kong. And once again, there was an Orwell book that was brought up. The students, when they were about to protest, started reading an Orwell book, but not 1984, Animal Farm. Animal Farm, if you boil it down to, it's often seen as a critique of Stalinism, but actually what it is in many ways is an allegory about a case in which you have a revolution that's supposed to do away with old forms of oppression, and then the new people in power are just like what the old people in power were. So in part, for Hong Kong, it was after the end of British colonialism. We had a new order, and it actually seems very much like a new kind of colonialism, this time from Beijing rather than from London. And I've been thinking about Animal Farm a lot since then. It wasn't one that was on my radar screen. And I've been thinking about it with 1989 and actually as far back as 1919. And I think about it with what's going on in China right now, including the things that Michael brought up, Xinjiang. I mean, one of the things that the Chinese Communist Revolution was supposed to do was do away with the kind of imperialism that was associated with the Japanese invasion of China, in which the Japanese had said in Manchuria, these people are backward. To become modern, they need us to be civilizing them. They need us to be remaking them, reforming them. And in many ways, that's now what Beijing is saying to Xinjiang and Tibet, is what the Japanese empire was saying to parts of China and other parts of Asia at the time. We want to remake you. So this is a case in which the Chinese Communist Party has become, like the pigs who took over the farm, an animal farm, a mirror image in some ways of what the villains are, I've been thinking. In 1989, there was a strong element of that as well, actually, even though it's not typically brought up. One of the posters the students brought up showed Deng Xiaoping as a kind of Empress Dowager figure operating from behind the scenes, controlling power. The suggestion was that's how the old China was supposed to be. The new China was not supposed to be like that. When I was on a 25th anniversary of Tiananmen panel with Wang Chaohua, another of the student leaders, she said one thing that people don't always appreciate about what led up to the protests of 1989 was the disgust that people felt when Deng Xiaoping purged or demoted Hu Yaobang. It's always thought Hu Yaobang had supported student movements. He was put down. She said part of it was he was saying, I have a chosen successor, but now I'm just changing that. That was a throwback to Mao, who kept changing his successors. Once again, this was supposed to be a new era, but the rulers were acting surprisingly like the old era. Again, it was the kind of Animal Farm syndrome. You can go back as far, this is the 100th anniversary of the May 4th movement. May 4th was about all kinds of things. It was a critique of imperialism, all kinds of things. But among other things, it was also a sense that a revolution had taken place that was supposed to change everything, but in many ways, the same patterns were recurring. The 1919 protests were what started the May 4th movement, but movements also often have precursors. Before 1989, there was 1986. Before the umbrella movement in 2014, there was a protest in 2012. Before the 1919 protests in China, there were 1915 protests in China. Those protests were in part about demands that Japan was making on the warlords, and the warlords were giving into. But it was also the year that Yuan Shikai, see if this sounds familiar to anybody thinking about today, Yuan Shikai, who was the president of a Republic of China that was supposed to be completely unlike the old order, set himself up as an emperor who could rule for life. So I think if we think about some of the frustrations that show up in these many different stages, from 1919 up to into 2019, when at Tsinghua University, Xu Zhangrun has been come under attack for being a critical intellectual, talking in part about Xi Jinping replicating the patterns that were supposed to be part of an old era, including doing away with term limits. Now, most recently, we have the talk of sending down youth, all of these things that seems throwback to a time that was supposed to be gone. Now, I don't want to say that it's kind of odd to say, well, why am I talking about all of these, why am I only talking about books by British writers who went to Eden as ways of understanding China? But you don't need to look outside, because Animal Farm, by my lights, is the great novella of the 20th century that talks about politics written in English. The great novella written about politics written in Chinese was The True Story of A.Q. by Lu Xun, a person of the May 4th generation, a person that the students of 1989 sometimes cited, one Chinese writer who sometimes will still be cited in Hong Kong. And The True Story of A.Q., part of it is about a revolution that didn't end up changing things other than who exactly was bullying ordinary people. And so I think we can see in this kind of trend, and it's not just, of course, in China that you see this kind of frustration with a revolution that claims to be about creating something that's completely new, but falls into these bad old patterns of that. And you can think of this as a recurring cry of Chinese speaking out against a flaw in an order, often in a very kind of effort to be a loyal opposition, but finding it impossible to have space for a loyal opposition from the days of Chen Duxiu and other founders of a new culture movement on up to Xu Zhengrun. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Jeff. I think the worst thing is China is not just having all of these problems similar in history, but the CCP has been exporting many of its values and influence and interference outside China with its so-called model of China model of governance with a hybrid of capital. State capitalism and authoritarian control, and it's more about money and power, and nothing matters. And let's hope that we would not let that win over, and we would keep our intellectual freedom. We would be able to, if any of you have any comments on each other or questions, we can do that. Otherwise, shall we open the floor? Because I see we have lots of audience who would have very interesting people in the audience who would have questions. Shall we open the floor, or anyone would like to jump on each other? Okay, good. So let's open the floor for Q&A then. As we mentioned earlier, no need to identify who you are. If you are sent by the CCP, yes, maybe. Oh, yes.
Thank you all very much. So my question is about, could there be another student protest that happened in Tiananmen? Not so much talking about the massacre, but could there even be a protest happening again? Thinking that, right now the censorship technologies in China have become so advanced, but on the other hand, there are protests like the students protesting for labor rights. Yeah, so could the Tiananmen protests happen again?
Yes.
Thank you.
Jeff?
Yeah, sure. So I think the Chinese Communist Party has developed very sophisticated methods to try to minimize the chance of that happening. And particularly what they've tried to prevent is any kind of protest that spreads from one social group to another. There's been a clampdown very much on those students because, in part, they're trying to connect to workers. There are protests in China all the time, and the protests, some of them are tolerated if they're in one locale, whereas 1989 spread across the country. If they're one social group, Tiananmen spread across social groups. So there certainly are protests, but there's a very specific one. So we both need to think about the fact of the creativity that people do to get around censorship and other things. One thing we didn't mention, one kind of protest that's happened recently is feminist protests, including the Me Too movement. When you were not allowed to use the words Me Too on the web, they started putting rice bunny, Me Too. So there is this great, it's not that the desire to protest has gone away, but the intensity with which things are stamped down upon whenever they seem to be spreading is something that so far, you never say never. Because the one thing I've learned studying student movements is before big student movements happen, people are often saying there could never, this group, this generation wouldn't lead a protest movement. We saw that in America a year and a half ago. This generation's a bunch of selfish millennials, post-millennials just looking at their cell phones. And then we had the biggest youth-led protests in decades after the Parkland shootings. So never write off a generation, but I think the odds are incredibly stacked against things right now.
I think there's also an economic argument against, that so many young Chinese are so focused on making enough money to get married, finding a job, buying a house. And they realize that, getting involved in politics is not going to help you achieve any of those goals. So I think people even talk about it as a kind of economic stability maintenance, that everybody's energies are focused in this one direction. And again, probably that's a lesson that the Communist Party learned really, that it has managed to impose really well on young people, that, political mobilization and political protest really doesn't pay. So I think that also would be something that acts against another student movement anytime soon. And certainly if you talk to, as I'm sure you have, young students in China, people just aren't that interested in politics. They're much more interested in buying the next iPhone, or, how to find a job, how to find an apartment, where to find a husband or wife. Those are the concerns that I think obsess people today.
I still have my hope on young generation, actually, because I believe democracy based on human nature, also based on human nature of a young generation. When I teach in Taiwan, I have chance to meet a lot of students come from mainland China. And I realize one thing is really interesting. Everybody come to the first day when they arrive in Taiwan and they have access to the internet, they key in the keyword June 4th or Tiananmen Massacre. I mean, there's one characteristic of young generation, which is curiosity. The curiosity always kills totalitarianism. If you keep this kind of curiosity, you want to know the truth. That's a young generation character. As old as me, I lost all my curiosity. I'm already know a lot of things about young generation. So I believe in the young generation's human nature. So I still have my hope.
Jian, do you have anything to add? Oh.
If you talk about the demonstration on Tiananmen Square, I cannot find any sign. In China, the surveillance is everywhere, and with the face recognize system. But I believe the ordinary people want keep their right, keep their money, keep their freedom. In fact, I believe you can, if you read on some internet or WeChat or Weibo, I believe the civil movement happen every day, but not a demonstration, not the movement as you imagine. Even in college or university, there are some students, they want to make some union in factory. They said, oh, I believe Marxism, but their action is being forbidden. Not about Marxism or capitalism. So I believe we should change our thinking, not the so crowded demonstration. Maybe the ordinary people everywhere in China, even in China. And by the way, about we want to keep the memory about June 4th. A lot of people talk about June 4th on internet or WeChat, use metaphor or ambiguous language. We create a lot of Louisa or something like
May 35th.
So I must emphasize, fighting is happened every day.
I think the price for people are trying to, the price is higher and higher. It's not like we talk about 86 and 87. After the 86, 87, the student movement, after Hu Yaobang was ousted, then there's still another chance for 89 for students to come out. But that, the political environment is totally changed. You see all those Marxism study group who try to support the workers recently, right, in Beijing, and they have been arrested. And the ordinary citizens who try to commemorate, for example, the 4 men who have this liquor labels, 酒 labels, and they also have been sentenced. So you have to pay a heavy price when you try to organize all kinds of events. And another thing is, I think that if they keep doing this, next time, if something like Tiananmen happen, it would not be out of love, out of hope, out of faith, but it would be out of anger, out of frustration, and out of grievances. Maybe that's something that would be really sad if they. Yeah, sure.
Can I add one more thing? I think young generation change very quick. I know a lot of people feel disappointed about young generation nowadays in China. But think about what happened in 1989. In 1987, when I enrolled in Beijing University, a lot of my classmates, they just play card, they prepare for the English exam, want to go to United States. Even me, myself, go to Beijing City to learn breaking dance. But then, 1989, everybody go to street. That's young generation.
Yeah, I debated this with Wang Dan a long time ago about this the four thing, right? Tall Pai, Ma Pai, praying Ma Jiao, trying to get TOEFL and dancing in 1989. And that's why
Don't ask me to dance, I already forget.
That's why he's always hopeful about the younger generation. But I think the regime had learned a big lesson too after 1989. So in 1989, when all the college doors are locked, students still find a way to go out. So then they try to make sure the next day, when all the doors are open, they would still choose not to go out and protest. If they protest, it will be defending the government. So that's something that I think I would like to keep in mind too about the changing political context, as well as the way the younger generation, the values they had. But even with that, I'm still long-term optimistic. I agree with Jeff. Every time when we see something big happen, big changes happen, the day before people would say that it's impossible. But then when something big happened the next morning on the street, everybody is telling you that that's inevitable. So I study history and I believe in history, and I think history is on our side. Eddie.
You just blew my cover by saying my name.
You don't look like a young Chinese student who might get in trouble.
I'm probably okay. So I have a question for Wang Dan. I first met you in 1988.
Oh, really?
When you were leading those amazing salons at Peking University with another person who is a hero of mine, Feng Lichi. But you were doing an exercise, if we had succeeded, what would that have looked like? What would have happened? So I want to ask a different question. If there had not been a crackdown on June 3rd, June 4th, what would have happened? My memory is that, by late May of that year, there were fewer students, certainly from Beijing. Many students were going back to campus. Yes, there were students coming from outside of Beijing to have the experience in the capital, but that the movement was losing steam. I remember I was a foreign correspondent. Many people, including myself, left China in late May, finally to get some vacation after covering the movement since the end of April, because it seemed to be winding down. It seemed to be losing steam. Then the government sends in troops, unarmed first, that brings everyone in Beijing out to the streets. The next night they come in with the tanks. It almost seemed that they were trying to create a rebellion that could be suppressed in order to reconcile the power struggle that was happening. Anyway, I'm going on too long, but my question is, if there had not been the crackdown, what would have happened? What would the students have done? How long would it have gone on?
Okay. Well, since you know me, you know in the end of May, we already proposed withdrawal from Tiananmen Square. But I have to say, in reality, even other student leaders like Chai Ling or Feng Congde or Li Lu accept our proposal. I do not think we can really ask a student to withdraw from Tiananmen Square. It's really difficult. It's not about the student of Beijing. Most of Beijing students are already back to campus or home, but we have more and more students come from all over the country, other provinces. They do not want to withdraw from Tiananmen Square. They just arrived the first day. A lot of people, a lot of students just the first day. So it's almost impossible. I don't think it's fair to criticize student leader like Chancellor that reject to withdraw, because I know it's almost impossible. But answer your question, if we have this chance to withdraw from the Tiananmen Square as our plan, we want back to campus to continue to do we call the 校园民主 campus democracy, or democracy in campus. That which means, for me myself, my only hope is if we come back to campus, we will keep one requirement that allow us to elect our own student association's leader. That's our requirement if we come back to the campus. But again, I don't think student can be pursued, because the government, they never accept our two requirements. I don't know if they can answer your question. Just a so-called 校园民主, just democracy in campus, that's our next step if we can withdraw from Tiananmen Square.
Anyone would like to add? Okay, I think also there's a new, I know Adi, we talk a lot when I invited you to my class, and then we mentioned that that's a possibility if they had withdrawn, what would have happened. But there's some recent discussions by Xiaoqing and Chen Xiaoya, and then they said that according to some of the unknown sources, documents, and actually Deng Xiaoping had already made up his mind to have the crackdown as long as April. That's what, right after the April 26th editorial. So it really doesn't matter what the students were going to do. They were determined that the one army is going to come in. And I have been asking for sources, but of course they are not sure yet. But that could be another point, that it really doesn't matter what they had decided to do, the students had decided to do, what would have changed, because it looks like Deng was very upset about what's going on, even as early as April. 你看到那个说什么?
I have one more opinion here is I think there will be crackdown anyway,
Yeah, that's what.
even though students withdraw from Tiananmen Square. What is April 26th editorial? It's back to that time, the government already made their mind to crack down student movement. So if we withdraw, maybe they're not so bloody, but there must be anyway another way they crack down students.
Thank you very much. And I have a question to Professor Jian. I read a press news about you in Apple Daily in Hong Kong yesterday. I'm wondering when and where you got the interview with Hong Kong. And also today you made a speech about June 4 outside of China. Is this critical to Chinese government? And if you go back to China, do you have any trouble with the Chinese government? And if yes, and what kind of trouble will you have?
Jeez.
What kind of trouble?
Sorry.
I answer your last question first. My answer for your last question, what kind of trouble I will got, I don't know.
We know.
I will go back to China. I will. Here, I'm just a visiting scholar. And for your early question, I accepted the interview in the beginning of this year in Beijing at my home. In fact, a lot of media prepared that reporter about this 30th anniversary. There are three foreign media want to interview me. In fact, I accepted the interview in Beijing on purpose. In fact, I can't accept this interview in Hong Kong. In fact, the crew will go to America. But I feel if I criticize the Chinese government and say something about Chinese situation, the most suitable place is in China. Thank you for care about me, my trouble. I don't know. I must
Do you want to
say,
speak Chinese? Is that better? 要说中文吗？
如果 if you could not understand my English, I can speak Chinese.
魏平说，请您说中文。
I must say, I don't know, because as Marcosani mentioned, Chinese situation changed. Maybe recent years, recent months, recent days, we don't know. Thank you.
I think Professor Hao Jian is not so naive to think that he's not going to have any consequences. I think the reason that we respect people like him is because for 30 years they know that there will be consequences, but they are still doing what they have been doing, and for that reason, I think that that's why he has all our respect. Yes.
I have two questions. The first question is for Professor Hao Jian. You just mentioned 3,000 students were died in Tiananmen Square, and I wonder how.
I mentioned.
Or I.
No.
Maybe now you.
I never mentioned.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Liu Xiaobo's book mentioned.
Oh yeah, sorry.
Okay.
Liu Xiaobo he mentioned, and I wonder how they died. Are they directly shot by the military, or they died with the device? Because in the interview between President Jiang Zemin and Wallace, our president directly announced that nobody got killed by the military during the Tiananmen Square event. He personally made the announcement during the interview. So that's why I have the first question for you. And the second question is for Professor Wang Dan. I want to ask about the democracy, because as I know, China cannot intimate U.S. democracy. What I mean is we cannot just use United States, their democracy policies to our countries, because we have different cultures, we have different situations. And how you define the democracy fit to us, to our country. And you just mentioned during Tiananmen Square, students proposed many demands to push our country to be more democratic. And I also see the other people who experienced Tiananmen Square event. They one person, he said that the government do accept some part of the requirement of the students. But the thing is, students become too radical. They lost the control. They don't want to withdraw from the Tiananmen Square. That's how when the bad things come. And I want to know the truth from you. Thank you. That's my two questions.
Can I ask quickly, if there's one thing Americans have learned, is that presidents sometimes lie.
Especially on that day.
But seriously, I mean, there have been careful analyses of what happened late at the night of June 3rd and early on the morning of June 4th. There were many people killed. Exact numbers are still hard to come by. At least hundreds, probably thousands. Many of them, in fact, the majority of them were not students. They were bystanders, ordinary Laobaixing, either had come out to support the protests or were either bystanders. Most, if not all of them, were not killed on the square. That's one thing that's disputed. How many people, if any, were killed on Tiananmen Square? But on the streets near Tiananmen Square, there really is no question that there were people fired upon by soldiers who died. There's also no question that there were at least a couple of soldiers or some soldiers who were killed, and in at least one case burned alive in a vehicle. These are, we can talk and we can argue, and there needs to be more investigation. All of us, I think, would like there to be a full investigation that would allow this, but there is no question that there was a massacre near Tiananmen Square in which many people, including some students, including many people who weren't students, died. That's all I'm going to say.
Jian, do you have anything to add?
Would you please translate for me?
Okay.
Because thank you very much for your question.
They do not need a translator.
非常感谢你的。
我请你来翻译。
翻中文吗？
我请你翻译，请你翻译。
翻中文给他吗？
对对，翻英文，翻英文。我说中文。
不是已经讲了吗？
中国政府或者中国的任何一个总统、总理跟我，总有一方在说谎。
So whether it's the Chinese government or whether it's the Chinese president or the premier or me, one of us is lying, right?
或者 CCTV 巴拉巴拉巴拉巴拉巴拉我只能说一点我个人的经历的情况。我刚才讲的，我亲眼见的只有一个，就是被枪打倒的，只有一个。我亲眼见到的被枪打倒的，但是我看见躺在这个板车上浑身流血的，就是当天晚上，我仅说当天晚上就有至少有4、5个，他们死没死我不知道，那是那天晚上。
So I can tell you what based on my personal experience, I did witness one person being shot, and then that night I also saw 4 or 5 bodies on a cart. They were bloody, and whether they were dead, I don't know for sure.
就好像 Professor, what is it difficult?
中文名字是花之剑，比较容易。
OK 就好像 Professor 花之剑刚才说的，中国政府在玩一个文字游戏。比如说长安街算不算天安门 Square？ 比如说天安门 Square 和天安门之间这个长安街算不算天安门 Square？
So just as Professor Hua Zhijian just pointed out, Chinese government was playing a game with words. Is Chang'an Avenue part of Tiananmen Square? Is that particularly that section of Tiananmen, that Chang'an Avenue that's adjacent to the Tiananmen Square? Do you consider that part of Tiananmen Square?
在很多年里头，我也一直跟我的朋友讲，非常可能天安门广场就是 exact 的这个天安门广场没有打死人。我也跟很多朋友讲，我也听到很多人讲，说没有看见。但是随着天安门母亲的调查，我也帮着他们做一些寻访工作。我们有了新的发现。
So for many years, I thought nobody was killed on Tiananmen Square, and I also heard from other people saying that nobody was killed on Tiananmen Square. But as the Tiananmen mothers started their investigation, as they started to look for truth, new information emerged.
有3个人。这个我不敢确认，因为这是我听说的。
I have evidence. You can continue. Yeah.
有是吧
Yeah.
有3个人是在天安门广场，这个具体的广场里面不包括长安街不包括北京，被打死的。
I heard that 3 people were shot dead. Within Tiananmen Square, we're not including the Chang'an Avenue, just the Tiananmen Square proper.
好，那最后说一下我自己亲眼看见的。就刚才我跟你们提到， 我跑了大约10几家医院，为了找我堂弟的尸体，我跑了大概10几家医院吧。
So again, back to my personal experience, I went to look for my cousin's body. So I went to over 10 hospitals.
我自己亲眼见到的身上有子弹的尸体，我不敢肯定的数字啊，大约有40-50具，大约。
The bodies with bullets in. Of course, I didn't count them specifically. I can't give you exact number.
我拉那个箱子来看啊。
But I saw 40 to 50 bodies with bullets in.
那么至少就是我堂弟这个他的这个子弹是，我们到医院的时候还有复兴医院的那个病历我看到的，但是我现在拿不到那个病历了。当时我们也没有人想到会去看那个病历，去拿那个病历。当时我是看到那个病历的，是子弹打左肩胛，抢救20分钟后死亡，就是至少我看到的大概是这些。
So when I went to Fuxing Hospital, then at that time, I did actually see my cousin's medical record. It didn't occur to me to take it back then, and there's no way now for me to get it. But I do remember on the medical record, it stated that the bullet went into his shoulder blade, and after 20 minutes of rescue work, he died.
希望我的记忆能够回答你的问题，谢谢。
So I hope my memory did serve to answer your question.
I just wanted to add a couple of extra words as well, just to remind people that the people didn't only die in Beijing, in Chengdu as well. The government admitted that 8 people were killed, including 2 students, and that was according to the government's own propaganda leaflets. But interestingly, in the last couple of years, some new documents have been emerging with other figures as well that would be well worth following up. In the last couple of years, some British diplomatic cables have been released that put the figures much, much higher. So originally, the Americans estimated that 300 people died in Chengdu. And the British cables that were released 2 years ago actually put the figures even higher. They estimate altogether 420 people killed, but they're very, very rough estimates. But it is worth, I think, noting that there were deaths in other places as well.
Mm-hmm. So there has been evidence documented in Liu Xiaobo's book by Perry Link, published by Harvard University Press. So his data, of course, on pages 5 and 6 in English, so everyone can check. So it's according to the Tiananmen Mothers information. The Tiananmen Mothers are connected. So there were 3 people that was directly shot and killed inside Tiananmen Square, and among them, the 3 is a student named called Cheng Renxin. He's a student of Renmin Daxue, the People's University, and he was age 25 years old. So again, he was shot and killed right next to the Qigan, the flagpole in Tiananmen Square. So that's one example. And his family was actually devastated after his father died. His mom tried to hang herself in the early 90s. And then the grandchild saw the grandmother hanging, and then he used his shoulder to do this so that she would not kill her, she would keep until the adults come home. So that's one example. Again, Cheng Renxin, age 25, shot and killed inside Tiananmen Square. But also in 2011, the China Daily did publish an article, Tiananmen as a Myth, and then it claimed that based on the wiki leakage, no one was shot and killed in Tiananmen Square. So there's no such a thing called the Tiananmen Massacre. But if you look at the information collected by the Tiananmen Mothers, there were 2 maps that have been created by volunteers according to this information of 202 victims specific locations where the body were found and with specific locations where the victims were killed. So only when they have two locations, we put them on the map. So Professor Hao Zhijing's Professor Hao Jian's cousin Hao Zhijing, he was shot and killed in Muxidi. That was one of the major locations where people were shot and killed in the area, and Hao Zhijing was shot there too. And then another major location is Liu Bukou, where the students were leaving back to Haidan after Tiananmen Square was clear, and then they withdraw, and the students were mainly crushed by tanks. So those are one of the two major. So it doesn't matter whether people were killed in Tiananmen Square. That's not the central question. The fact is the massacre happened throughout central Beijing, as Professor Jeff Wasserstrom already mentioned that. So and Louisa mentioned that it's other places too. So there is a massacre in Tiananmen Square. We call that Tiananmen massacre exactly like we call Tiananmen movement. It doesn't mean it's just happening in Tiananmen Square itself. It's a nationwide movement. Tiananmen massacre doesn't mean that it only happened inside Tiananmen Square, but it's throughout central Beijing. And I hope that answers your question about whether there is a massacre or not. Oh, yeah, Wang Dan, sorry.
I have my job to do. I have finished it.
Yeah, of course.
About democracy, I think you have a lot of hearsay. I don't know where did you get it. Hao Jian said he didn't say 3,000 people died in Tiananmen Square. And I didn't say I want to use Americans' democracy apply to China. I never say that. If you can give me some link, I'll be appreciated for that. But I don't think I said that. Because I don't know what is so-called United States democracy. I've been studying here at Harvard for 10 years. I never learned what's United States democracy. I even feel more confused nowadays about democracy of United States. So I definitely will not apply United States democracy to China. And my definition for democracy is, at the early stage of the democratization of China, is not to do something. That might, I admit that might lead to some turmoil, but it's not to do something. I think the first stage of democratization, if Chinese government wants to do, is stop of doing something. Stop doing that will not lead to the social turmoil, right? Stop put somebody in jail just because they see something on internet. Even Chinese people can see it. That's my definition of democracy, not United States.
And the students in 1989, they actually got this democracy that looks different from the one in New York. And yes, yes.
Thank you guys for coming, first of all, especially for Wang Dan to be here. I want to ask you guys a question on, I think, in the 80s, we've seen that, within the CCP, there's a lot of struggle between the liberals and the conservatives, and there is a short-lived period where, U.S. China are very close, and then there is, liberal reforms going on in China with freedom of press, freedom of speech, again, short-lived. And I would imagine that those voices that were there to support the student movement at that time should still somehow exist within the CCP, right? We've seen leaders like Zhao Ziyang, Bao Tong, Wen Jiabao. Those are supposedly people who are sympathetic to the movement. And I was just wondering, what are the legacies of those leaders within the CCP now? And are there points of history where they would be allowed to express those voices more strongly than they do now? Thank you.
Meeting.
About the legacy of those liberal leader of CCP, I think maybe that's one I could see is I've been experiencing the whole 1980s. I think at that time, those leaders, including Hu Yaobao and Zhao Ziyang, and maybe Deng Xiaoping, they still can give some space to the society. They let the society grow up by themselves at some degree. But now, situation become worse and worse. And under the control of Xi Jinping, society lost their space. And that's why I think the CCP's leader lost the legacy of the Hu Yaobao and Zhao Ziyang. I don't know what other speaker.
So playing on history, I just wanted to bring up one thing because it is a very depressing moment thinking about China. But it's 30 years after a massacre and you can't talk about the event and things like that. there's a lot of oppression. 30 years after Irvine in Taiwan, the 1947 massacre, 30 years after it, there was martial law. You could not talk about it. You could not commemorate it. The leader of Taiwan at that point was Jiang Jingguo, a dictator's son who had run the secret police. Not a sprouts of liberalization kind of leader, but not that much longer because of shifts and all kinds of things. There was, you reached a point where there was acknowledgement. Now there's a park devoted to Irvine. So I don't see the roots of anything like that in China. But I think it's important to not the changes in authoritarian one-party states, the world has to change, unexpected things have to happen, but it's important, I think, to not think because you can't see them that there's no chance. And I co-wrote a piece with Margaret Lewis on this, who had she studies Taiwan, and she had a great line. And she said, the Communist Party has proved remarkably resilient in recent years, but Taiwan shows you even resilient objects break. So that's one kind of thing to hold on to. But we don't know when. And we don't know when somebody like a liberalizing figure could emerge.
Thank you so much. I have a question actually in regards to the mobilization during the movement. I'm trying to ask, why do you guys think the movement succeeded in mobilizing a large number of students into the collective action, which, was risky, right? And some scholars argue that there's a dense distribution of colleges in Haidian district in Beijing, and that's one of the reasons that lowers the cost of communication and monitoring. And I was wondering, what are your takes on this topic, on this question?
What he asked how, your question is how did us organize a large number of students?
Why do you think the movement succeeded in mobilizing a large number of students?
Oh yeah, same question. Well, I don't know. Really, we have a very first parade which happened in April 17, late night, April 17. Mm-hmm. Nobody organized it. Mm-hmm. Somebody dropped, how to say English, 脸盆, how to say 脸盆? What's 脸盆?
Basin, right?
Basin. Just somebody drop a basin in the restroom. Quite long, there's a huge dump. Everybody go to the triangle, some location. Then we get together. Then we go to Tiananmen Square. I don't know why that student do that, but so I don't know how to. Under some circumstance and under some atmosphere, that's why we always said it's not intentionally organized movement. So a movement is just depend on the willingness of students themselves. We didn't organize them.
In my opinion, the Tiananmen massacre is a result of 1980s. During the 10 years, that's the real reopening and the reform period of China. I believe in 1989, the communist totalitarian regime crapped with Western value. We always talk about 1980s in China. Even now, we always talk about it. During the 10 years, we read a lot of foreign books. The 2 books you mentioned, and a lot of Hollywood movie, and translated by Xiaoqing. As Wang Dan said, because the collapse happened, so we don't need to move anyone. No one 动员
mobilized.
Yeah, that's happened. I believe the collapse, maybe that happened today.
I I can give you a more serious answer. I mean, in the process of organization of such a mass movement, in 1989, self-discipline is very important. We as leaders just follow students, and all those students, they have really high level of self-discipline.
Professor 崔卫平，中文是吗 ？OK， 可以。
好的，好。好，谢谢。郝建教授一开始说，这是他第一次公开的谈6·4，我在这方面跟他有很多共同的记忆。
So Professor Hao Jian mentioned at the beginning that this is the first time he can and he's openly talking about June 4th. I actually shared that common memory with him.
一直到1999年，也就是说，89、6410年之后，我和郝建教授才第一次谈到6·4的问题。虽然我们已经同事多年，而且甚至我还是他的表亲，我们都没有谈过这件事。
So it was 10 years after the June 4th incident. It was only in 1999 that Professor Hao Jian and I were able to start talking about June 4th. Even though we had been colleagues for many, many years, we also have some, we're also sort of distant relatives.
20年前，也就是像今天这样一个春天百花怒放的时刻，我们还好好活着，可是郝建带我去了墓地，去了万源公墓，然后我第一次看到了，公墓里面那些6·4的遇难者的墓碑，我非常的震撼。
So 20 years ago, it was in the spring day. It was in the spring like this, the flowers were all blooming, and I was having a sort of a normal life, and then Professor Hao Jian took me to the cemetery. That was the first time. That was the first time I saw all the tombstones, all the tombs of the people who died on June 4th.
从此以后，我们成了好朋友。在6·4的问题上，我们就紧紧的也可以叫团结在一起吧。我刚才想，记忆可以使得我们，记忆可以帮助拯救我们。从6·4之后的那种沉默的或者失语的状态当中，恢复过来。
So it was after that we became good friends, and the memory of June 4th has united us, brought us very close. Memories can help save us.
后来我们就20年前，对，我们后来就每年6·4在一起，或者看一个6·4的电影，或者我们讨论这样的事情，一直到2004年。我们一起参加不同的关于6·4的公开签名，然后被学校找谈话。后来我们一起做了许多活动，签名啊、抗议啊、声援啊，一直到2009年和2014年，郝建教授推动，我们在国内开了2个关于6·4的研讨会。
So since then, every on 4th of July, on June 4th, every year we would get together and on that very day. And since 2004, we've Hao Jian and I together have joined public petitions, and we have been both called by the college university leaders to have a talk, and from 2009 to 2014, we have been organizing and participating in various events relating to June 4th.
尽管这样，但是我是今天第一次听郝建说郝志金的故事，我还是非常的感动。
Despite our close ties and our many years of working together, today was the very first time that I heard the story of Hao Zhijing, Hao Jian's cousin.
那我想问郝建教授，就是找到郝志军之后，是你通知郝志军父母的吗？他们来北京没有？他们的反应是什么样的？他们以后的日子是怎么过的？
So my question for Hao Jian is, after you had found Hao Zhijing, was it you who notified his parents? Did his parents, what was his parents' reactions? Did they come to Beijing? What were their lives like after they learned about their son's death?
我们找了大约半个月，在这个半个月当中，就是感觉到凶多吉少了，所以是先把郝志京的父亲接到了北京。这个时候还没有找到郝志京的尸体。
So we looked for Hao Zhijing's body. We looked for Hao Zhijing for about half a month, and the more we looked, the more we felt, probably the news wouldn't be good. So we actually got Hao Zhijing's father to Beijing first, without even knowing for sure Hao Zhijing's whereabouts.
找到了尸体以后，然后把我的婶婶接到了北京。对不起，找到尸体的时候还是在复兴医院的那个大冰柜里面。那天我们去找到的时候还有8具尸体。
So when we found him, his body actually was in a big freezer in Beijing, in Fuxing Hospital. There were also 8 other bodies there.
尸体是全身是乌灰的，因为撒了很多的防腐剂，所以尸体变乌黑。
So the bodies were all, jet black because there was a lot of chemicals on them to prevent them from getting rot.
找到尸体以后，把他母亲接到北京，然后在北京办了后事。
So it was only after we found the body that we got his mother to Beijing, and we had a funeral.
郝志京是他们家的独生子。
Hao Zhijing was his parents' only child.
对，现在2位老人风烛残年，所以这个也是我经常要回中国。我刚才跟大家讲说，我是要回中国的一个非常重要的原因。
Now his parents are both, they're old and they're childless. That's one of the reasons that I go back to China, and I just told you guys that I would definitely be going back to China.
非常感谢崔平教授提这个关于个人的生活经验的这么细节的问题，而不是大历史的假设走向。
I'm very grateful to Professor Cui Ping for raising this question, for asking about the personal side of the personal experience, asking the parents' personal experience, instead of just focusing on big history, big trends.
最后介绍一句崔平，崔平教授就是那个我的学生说，哎，你不是郝建的学生吗？你要因为一个警察配一个我们学校的人，你跟踪郝建不合适，你跟另外一个警察去跟踪崔卫平去。
So last a little bit of a story, a little bit of information about Professor Cui Ping, right? So anyway, so in our school, it's one policeman following one professor, right? But since the initial policeman that was assigned to follow me was my student, so they assigned him to follow Professor Cui.
谢谢崔平教授。
Thank you, Professor Cui Ping.
I know time's up, but I saw a lot of hands. So are we supposed to leave on time or?
A few minutes more. Maybe one or question.
Okay, one more talk. Maybe on. On the back? Yeah, the gentleman, yeah. On the back. Okay.
Hi, thanks for your presentations. I apologize if my questions are controversial. I'm very sorry for your losses and the tragedies that's caused by the Tiananmen event. But my question is more focused on the question that Wang Dan discussed, which was what would China be like if Tiananmen Square succeeded? But my question is, what would happen to China if Tiananmen Square did not happen? And we also know at the time, I think Deng Xiaoping was open to reforms. So do you think that the Tiananmen incident further eradicated that possibility of reform? I mean, if you just waited a few more years after 1989, would the reform happens? So basically, the Tiananmen Square caused the increased repression that the Chinese people are feeling now.
Okay, thank you. That's typically my question. I have this question many times. What happened in 1989? There are two things. I think this a very big misunderstanding about what happened in 1989 is we just called it June 4th. No, that's not only June 4th. There's two things that happened in 1989. One is 1989 democracy movement. Two, that's the crackdown on June 4th by the government. That's two things. Yes, the progress stopped, but not by the student movement, by the crackdown by the government. I mean, students have every right on Constitution of China to go to street to express their opinion. There's nothing to criticize them, but government have choice. You can accept those two very moderate requirements, and you can bloody crack down it and turn China to another way. So it was not students should take this responsibility. Definitely government should take this responsibility.
And also in Zhao Ziyang's secret memo that Adi was one of the co-editors, he make it very clear, one of the three reasons the student participated in 1989, number three reason was because after 1987, when Hu Yaobang and Fang Lizhi were ousted, the reform had already came to a standstill, and that was the reason the students think that they should take to the street and push for the political reform instead of the movement itself stop the reform.
So I just say you actually can't disentangle it quite that way, because what happened after 1989 was also the unraveling of Communist Party rule in Eastern Europe and the breakup of the Soviet Union. And a lot of the repression now is done in the name of preventing any possibility for the kind of changes that happened there. So there are more things involved than just internal to China. It's a really interesting question, but I think there are all kinds of ways that history can unfold.
Okay, so I have to be. Oh, there's more. Okay, so our Communist Party leader tells us to stop now. Not Michael, just me. Okay, dictatorship. So I appreciate all the infuse. I see that you have more questions. I apologize. It's all my fault that we run out of time now. So you're welcome to come up to talk to our speakers. And thank you so much for coming today. Truth and reconciliation. Without truth, there would be no reconciliation. So China has to face its past in order to have a future, and I'm sure that we will see change, if not in my lifetime, as my late mentor, Professor Mafaga, if not in my lifetime, then in yours, the younger generations. Thank you.